Letters from Iwo Jima, directed by Clint Eastwood, the sister film to Flags of Our Fathers, with both movies essentially telling the same story from the opposite perspectives. As I've said in my review of Flags, I've seen both back to back, just like they were made, and I do think that that's the proper way to experience them. I think they complement each other, and viewing both makes each of them seem a little better. As a purely individual film, I enjoyed Letters more though. It tells the story of the battle for Iwo Jima during the Second World War from the perspective of Japanese soldiers. And unlike the previous film, which mainly showed us the propaganda around the famous flag raising photograph and what happened to the soldiers after the battle, this film is much more straightforward and concentrates on just the conflict itself. We start off several months prior with the Japanese army preparing the defenses of the island. General Kuribayashi, played by Ken Watanabe, arrives and takes charge and immediately switches things around. Up until then, the Japanese military on the island were very entrenched in their traditional doctrines. They were aiming to build most of the defenses on the beaches and stop the enemy there or die in suicide attacks. Kuribayashi thought that this was nonsense and ordered to abandon the beach completely, instead building a network of elaborate tunnels under the island's hills so that the soldiers could stay hidden, move around quietly, and harass the enemy from their hideouts. This approach was viewed by many of his subordinates as completely crazy, as it went against all traditional doctrine, but it did prove very effective in the end, as the Japanese managed to hold the island for more than a month against overwhelming American forces. So on the one hand, we see the battle unfold through the eyes of Kuribayashi and experience that conflict between tradition and custom and something new, a new way of thinking. On the other hand, we also meet a couple of regular Japanese soldiers and see what happens to them as well, occasionally also flashing back to their lives before the war. So despite being such a different approach to the story from Flags of Our Fathers, I think the main themes remain similar, and that is removing the romanticism and myths surrounding war, demystifying it. Once again, we are shown the contrast between what is being said officially and loudly and how the battle on the ground actually looks like. And like before, we learn that the reality is much more dirty and tougher to swallow than what the leaders may want us to believe. I also liked Letters because of the successful way in which it humanizes its characters. Each of the main ones that we meet, despite being so different from one another, gets a few moments for us to truly understand them and relate to them and see the situation through their eyes. Something that I think was missing from Flags of Our Fathers. I also think that using the flashbacks in a much more conservative way, and for the most part keeping to the linear structure of the story, works in the movie's favor. It's straightforward and easy to follow throughout its entire runtime. I do still have a similar criticism that I had for Flags, which is that the movie looks drearily grey and uninteresting. And yes, I can understand the argument that that's what Eastwood wanted it to look like, but I maintain that the cinematography looks lazy for the most part. It's not like a serious effort was made to show this battlefield as a hellish landscape. It's just shot normally with a heavy grey filter on every single scene. Kind of reminded me of the later Harry Potter movies, which have the same thing. Believe me, you can make a movie look bleak and dark in terms of color without making it look boring. This looks boring. So the visual side took a bit of enjoyment out of the viewing, but I have to say, even despite that, Letters from Iwo Jima is a rather competent film. It's a solid look into the Pacific theater of war that showcases that senselessness of war itself while handling its characters very well. Good film.